Hi, I'm Marc Rader, a faculty member here at Morling College, and today I'm busting a few myths about the Old Testament. Do I need to start at Genesis and read straight through? Well, I suppose the answer to that is yes. However, I would say that it's not always helpful to start right at the beginning. Sometimes we need to understand the big picture in order to make sense of the beginning. Sometimes when we start at the beginning with Genesis, we have too many questions that aren't really answered for us adequately. I would suggest starting in Genesis 12. Is the Old Testament just laws and weird stories? Absolutely not, although it does include lots of laws and lots of weird stories. The Old Testament is the story of God about His plans and His purposes in the world. It explains to us the importance and also the meaning of Jesus' own ministry. And so while there are some strange texts that we have to grapple with, it tells such an important story, it's too critical to leave behind. What's one Old Testament book everyone should start with? It's a good question. A lot of it would depend probably on how familiar you are with the story and what you're hoping to achieve. So for many Christians in particular, the book of Psalms is already fairly familiar. That's not a bad place to start. Or you might be interested in the stories, some of the stories in Exodus or in the early parts of Genesis 12 and following that you're kind of familiar with, some of the main characters. Or you might want to just kind of dip your toe into the prophets with, say, the book of Hosea or one of those. But it does depend on what you are hoping to learn from your experience in the Old Testament. Can one psalm help you understand a whole Bible theme? No. However, Psalms can be very helpful in helping us connect a biblical theme with our own experiences and with the kind of the emotion of that theme. So something like kingship, for instance, and God's rule in the world can really be helped by understanding, say, Psalm 2, for instance, a royal psalm that talks about the role of God's anointed one in the world. Does the Old Testament still matter for everyday faith? Absolutely. The Old Testament underscores and undergirds the New Testament. So much of what we understand and believe about Jesus is really focused on and built upon the Old Testament. The deeper our understanding of the Old Testament, the deeper our appreciation of the New Testament will be. And on top of that, in the narrative accounts that we have in the Old Testament, we have all these wonderful examples, and sometimes not wonderful examples, of what it looks like to try to live faithfully with the Lord in our day and age as well. If someone feels intimidated by the Old Testament, where should they begin? Well, they should begin by coming to Morling College and doing OT 003, an overview of the Old Testament. But I'm not sure that's exactly what you're after. Apart from doing some introductory study, which is always quite helpful, I would suggest, as I've said in the answer to another question, starting with the story of Abraham in Genesis 12 and paying real attention to what God is doing in the story. Doing some sort of formal study can be really helpful because it often provides us just with the keys to unlock what we're reading. Once we have a little bit of background, we can actually go quite a long way. What's one thing people often misunderstand about the Old Testament? I think one of the things that people commonly misunderstand about the Old Testament is that it is somehow separate from or different from the New Testament. That the stories that we find there are all about God's wrath and about God's anger and about the promises of judgment. And then we have Jesus, who's just all about loving your neighbor as yourself. And that puts a divide between the two testaments, which is really, really unhelpful. I think one of the things that is, I wouldn't say hidden, but it is described in different kinds of language, is the grace of God. It is evident from the very opening chapters of Scripture all the way through. And while the portrait of God's grace is a little bit different, we can sometimes miss it and assume, therefore, that the God of the Old Testament is somehow different from the God of the New. Nothing could be further from the truth. Do Christians still need the Old Testament? Again, I would say absolutely. The more we understand the Old Testament, the concepts within it around sacrifice and around the temple and the tabernacle, around kingship, around God's plans and purposes for his people in the covenant, the more deeply we'll be able to appreciate the ministry of Jesus. So much of Jesus' ministry was based on teaching from the Old Testament. And Jesus himself saw himself as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. So anytime we take opportunity to really explore and understand the Old Testament, we are setting ourselves up to better understand Jesus and those who followed him, who also saw him as the fulfillment of Scripture, who regularly and routinely quoted from the Old Testament as they sought to explain not only who Jesus was, but the implications for following him in everyday life.